Hello, I'm Nathan Willoughby, the Dean of the School of Theology and Christian Ministry at Anderson University. We are here in the Blackbird Media Lab, where we are recording our first annual Church Multiplication and Discipleship event. And this is our third panel, where we are going to get into some of the ways that you need to think about the way that a multiplication DNA is happening in your context and in your ministry. So my panelists today, I have Jake Zaske, Reverend Dr. Jake Zaske, Reverend Efrain Cirillo, and Reverend Katie Lance. And so we're going to be talking about a variety of topics, including models, the best examples that we've seen happening, and resources that are available to you, no matter what your context. So Jake, why don't you tell us about your experience in multiplication?
Absolutely. It's good to be with everyone again. So as a quick reminder, I have the privilege of serving as the co-state pastor for the state of Kansas in the Church of God, also co-founder of something called Trellis, which is all about raising up the next generation of pastors, and then the lead pastor at Hope Chapel, Kansas City. And my journey took me all the way from Chicago to England to California to New York City and to Kansas City. And it was a journey that I didn't realize from the very beginning that God would have me on, leading me into all these places of multiplication. But looking back, as we often do with our own journeys, it's quite a beautiful experience. So I grew up outside of Chicago, about an hour away in a town called Rockford, Illinois. Felt that call to ministry, was trained in ministry and sent out. Spent time in Manchester, England, in a church that was going through revitalization of a few hundred people, a leadership transition that led us through a lot of painful conversations, and then on the other side, a new life cycle. In that time, felt the call to plant a church. I didn't know where, I didn't know when, but I knew at some point the Lord would call us into that. And I had a friend who was planting a church in Southern California and enrolled at Fuller Seminary, started to help with this church plant in the number 2 chair, saw that church really take off and begin to reach hundreds of people, came out of the workforce in a job in finance back to be part of the church plant. And then as we began to pray and discern, God, where would we plant this church? The Lord was so faithful to lead us to parachute drop in the middle of New York City, one stop from Grand Central Station. We would plant a congregation out of our living room that moved to a steakhouse, and then to an Italian restaurant, and then to a school, and then to another congregation, and then into the merging of 10 other churches. And then eventually wondering, is this what we would do the rest of our life? The Lord said, there's another season I'm calling you into. It's a season in Kansas City and into the Church of God. And so we then handed that church off to our associate pastor. The church is thriving today. I have the privilege of still serving on the board of that church, and have also the privilege of being involved in a number of church plant boards even today. We stepped into Kansas City about 7 years ago to one of the leading churches in the Church of God, have seen that church transition into a new life cycle, and since have been involved in 3 separate merger opportunities, all valid forms of multiplication as people step into new life cycles. So now our church has changed its name during COVID. We have still the same heart and DNA around the Great Commission and, of course, the Great Commandment. And as we've seen God structure us as one church in 4 locations across Kansas City, what we see is we're just at the beginning of raising up next generation leaders, sending them out, and being involved in some of the things that this movement has to offer when it comes to multiplication. So I am privileged to be here. Thank you for the time to be able to explain that. Hopefully it helps us move the needle on our conversation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Efrain Cirillo, and I currently serve as the state pastor for Texas Ministries of the Church of God, and also as lead pastor of Ministry and Multiplication for Wake Church in Conroe, Texas. A little bit about my journey as it comes to multiplication. I was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, grew up in the Bronx, New York, and from there, I ended up going to college at Central Pennsylvania. That was where I met my beautiful wife and began to attend a Church of God congregation in Central Pennsylvania that loved the Lord. And that's where, man, God just did a great work in my heart and in my wife's heart to be about the mission of the local church, to be about the Great Commission, to reach those who are far from God. And we just fell in love with Jesus' mission, to go and make disciples of all nations. And so for us, that's where it started. After we graduated, we got married, and then we started into a college ministry. And from there, we felt the Lord call us to Texas. And so we arrived in East Texas, and I was able to pastor a church in East Texas that led into a multi-site church, and just seeing God do some amazing work there. Well, after a series, almost about 9 years, God has stirred our hearts to plant in the greater Houston area. So my family took a journey down south, about 3 hours down south to Houston, Texas, and we were able to plant a church, and God is doing some great works there with the local church. And so right now, our emphasis and our focus in this season is to equip pastors and churches to make disciples who make disciples and push the needle towards church multiplication in the state of Texas.
Hi, I'm Katie Lance. Glad to be here with you. I gave my life to Christ in my early 20s, so I did not grow up in a relationship with Christ. However, I was born or reborn into a church plant of 3 years old, so I was immediately exposed to that disciple-making and multiplication DNA from the start. Over the next 10 years, I was a part of, 12 years, that was a part of 6 different church plants in different contexts, urban, suburban, rural, micro church, large church, and in different roles. The last of which was a church plant that my husband and I co-planted. Along the way in identifying the call into formal ministry and church planting multiplication, I went to Wesley Seminary for church planting and multiplication certification to study it, while also doing internships and residencies along the way in the church plants and learning more than I did in the classroom in the trenches. And so my husband and I have a strong love for the church and reaching the lost. And if there's one thing that I think we can all relate in all of this, is it is possible. It is possible, no matter the dynamic or context that we're in, to be a part of this movement.
Great. So we have a few questions. We're going to jump around a little bit. Feel free to just respond to each other. Let's start here. So among the three of you, you've all had experience in some type of revitalization, multiplication things. We have church planting, multi-site, mergers, revitalizations. What would be, for each of you, your biggest takeaway from being a part of those experiences?
It's a great question, and I'll take the lead on this. I think one of the things that we recognize is that new life cycles come in all shapes and sizes. And so there are similarities, even though they're all radically different callings. One is great faith. I mean, the amount of risk and faith that it takes to open a church is the same risk and faith it takes to close a church. The same risk and faith it takes to merge a church. The same risk and faith it takes to make that bold decision to replant and to step into a new season. They're all radically different, but they all take incredible faith. And so as I sit here and recognize we've got people in all different environments and different seasons, realize that everybody needs to be on the faith journey. And those faith journeys are exciting, they're scary, and they're always going to cost us something. But it's His kingdom, and it's the whole, not my will, but yours be done. And on the other side, we see beautiful life transformation that we get to celebrate in every one of those situations. And I think if we can be about one thing, it's about asking ourselves the question, what is the next faith step? Perhaps the question we ask on a Sunday morning, even off the platform, but beginning to personalize that, even as we have many leaders in this room, that are going to have to make some of those bold decisions, not just once or twice, but maybe several times throughout their ministry journey.
Yeah. Efrain.
Yeah, no, that's great. You know, early on in our multiplication journey, there was this quote that really just stood out to me. Your greatest contribution to the kingdom of God may not be something you do, but someone you raise. In order to multiply effectively, plant churches, or even do multi-site, we have to always look at our pipeline in our church. I'm a firm believer that God has placed leaders in our congregations. And it's important for us to really ask God, who is it that's in my congregation right now that you have called me to invest in? To tap on the shoulder, to say, hey, I see in you leadership. And then call them out, call them up, train them, equip them. Because leadership starts from within the church. And as we build up people, raise people up, then not only raise them up, empower them to then send them and release them to be able to do kingdom work. That's very important for us in our local context. So having that concept of looking within your congregation, seeing who's there, is very important to put them on a trajectory with the plan to send off and multiply. Another thing I would say is, as leaders, senior leaders especially, we have to be able to hold things loosely. Oftentimes we're grateful of the church growth, and the temptation is to lean into building your own kingdom instead of God's kingdom. I know we've heard that before. And so we end up holding on to things tightly, and we think it's ours instead of God's. But maybe God has given you resources, time, talents, people to be able to build His kingdom. And so for us, as we let things go, as we release God's resources, as we send God's resources to other areas strategically, with fresh vision and a heart for multiplication, we will be able to see God do some amazing things. So holding things loosely is also very important. So,
Thanks.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I have taken in over the big picture is that God's promises stand true in the test of time, and He always makes a way. So if He's asked us to do something, it is possible. Sometimes we have to get creative. So you think outside the box. We have to have people surrounding us that can see our blind spots or see what or who we're missing, and to challenge us. And panels like this, where we're talking about outside the box ideas and sharing, sparking off of each other in our round circles, and being able to go and think and then apply things that were not even a part of our paradigm in the first place. But God will always give us what we need to do what He's asking us to do. And if we can hold to that, even in those times, if we can hold to that, He will get us through that, because it's His desire that the world come to know Him and be reconciled, right? Yeah. So we know He's on our side for this.
So this is a reminder, if you're watching, you can click that QR code, send in questions and answers. We're going to have 30 or 40 minutes at the end to answer some of those questions. One, for me, I think there were seasons of my ministry during my kind of training and preparation. I went to conferences on church planting. I ended up deciding that my gifts and calling wasn't exactly planting, but there was a very real sense that I was seeking for the place where I was, to not stay stagnant, to not be just what it had been, but to look for the opportunities. And we partnered with different congregations. The congregation I pastored had attempted a Spanish service, and that didn't work, but they didn't give up. Like, we kept trying different things. One of the things I think is really important is to hear just some nuts and bolts, because we got people in all kinds of different contexts. What are the variety of models, right? There are multiple models. So what are some of the models that you've seen work? What are some of the strengths and weaknesses of certain models, so that people can start to kind of catch a glimpse of, oh, I didn't think I could do that, but this I could see happening. So I don't know, what are some models that work?
Yeah, I'll start off. I mean, I think for us, one of the things that we realized early in our church planting journey is that we needed to collaborate with other networks that have success in planting. And so for us, we partnered with Stadia Church Planting Network. And so they have a variety of different resources available. So for them, they had assessments that we went through, project managers as well. They have a discovery process where, early on, pastors could go through, or leaders, and see if they qualify or there's a lack of a better term, would be successful in planting a church. There's certain attributes that they look for And so as we were doing that, we learned early on that kingdom collaboration is key. I mean, they even provided like a bookkeeper, right, early on to get things started. So there's different models. I mean, you have a launch large model where you're preparing a year ahead or 6 months ahead, 7 months ahead, where you're doing outreaches into the community to begin to gain awareness, build a team, develop a team, and then to launch the church. And then on top of that, you have fundraising, right? You can't really plant a church without funds. So part of the church planting journey is learning how to fundraise and getting equipped in that. And so, so there is that model. There's models where you just start off with small groups in your house, smaller contexts, where you're just developing leaders and having small groups. Starting from there, get to a certain number of groups, and then you could go into your Sunday gathering. And then along with that, you have a hybrid of both, which we did. It was a hybrid of both. As you're preparing for the Sunday morning experience, you're also making disciples on the ground and developing leaders before you launch. So I hope that answers your question on models. But there's also different ways where churches can be a part of multiplication. So I'll just leave that there.
What are some ways that you've seen churches, so let's say in the Wesleyan Church, what are some of the ways that you're leading folks for a random congregation, pick a state you want, and say, well, we don't have a church planner among us, but we believe that churches should expand, or we don't have this calling, but we have a person. What are some of the ways that churches can get connected regardless of the specifics of that kind of call?
So I've neglected to say I'm a part of the Wesleyan Church. I serve as Director of Discipleship, and I work closely with Amy and Jesse Pratt, who are Directors of Multiplication. And so we share this movement process. But in the Wesleyan Church, we're after all models. All models, all people will reach all people everywhere. So house church, micro church, pioneering projects or fresh expressions, coffee house models, taco truck we have, where are the people, what's your call, how are we going to get to them? Dinner church models, marketplace multipliers, being the church in your workplace and in the marketplace intentionally. Dirt roads networks for rural church planting, where multiple churches will come together, small budget, small congregation, and the power that can come from the collaboration. And so coming out of those things and looking, we are intentionally celebrating sending churches, people and pastors who are willing to let go of 10, 20% of their congregation and their tithes and resources, right? And the relationships to be sent to begin a new expression of the gospel in a new context to reach new people. Certain churches may not have the people to be sent, but maybe they will have resources to. I know multiple churches who have 10% of their budget off the top invested in church multiplication. So if they're not going to be able to be sending in this season, then what is a church plant starting or a fresh expression that we can help support in that way? Prayer, sending teams, committing to a church plant in the area who you'll say, hey, we're going to help staff or with your financial budget, we're going to help staff your children's ministry, or how can we serve? You need walls painted. What do you need? You got us for 6 months, or you got us for a year. And really helping church plants and expressions to start off healthy and supported, and let alone what that's like knowing that you're not in this endeavor alone, right? So there's many different ways. Internships, residencies, pulpit exposure, to have church planters coming in and other people to have that space to be developed, and so that, again, successful in the process of launching out.
I think with so many different models out there, the question could become, what is a church?
Okay. Yeah.
And what is valid? And churches through the years have been organized around the same 4 guiding principles. It's theology, it's ethics, it's practices, and it's authority. So we have a shared view of who God is. We have a shared view of how we see the world. That's theology and ethics. There are shared practices. We meet on Sunday mornings or Thursday nights, or Wednesdays at 5 a.m. For all those who love a good early morning prayer meeting. And then we have a clear sense of authority. Who's in charge, right? How are we structured? How are we organized? Beyond that, the size, the location, the frequency of meeting, the frequency of formation, all of that really does vary. And you can hear that in the way that Katie's describing it, is that there is shared theology, shared ethics, shared practices, and shared authority. But after that, all forms are valid. I was sitting with a guy years ago at a church planters gathering, a round table. And he said, you know, I've been all over the world, in cities in the Middle East, cities in Africa, cities in North America, South America. He says, it just seems like God seems to reach a city the same way in every one of those cities. He goes, you seem to have hundreds of neighborhood churches, extended families, 70, 80, 90. You can look at all your sociology studies around why that is. He says, and then there seem to be a few regional churches where they have a little more sway and play in an extended region. And then you have what you might call 3 to 5 cathedrals, citywide ministries that seem to have influence beyond the city as well. I don't know why he does it that way. But the idea of having a house church or trying to pit large church against small church or small church against big church or rural church against urban church, we need all forms. And I think that's what you're hearing around this table. The real question is, what is God calling you into? And how can you be faithful theologically, ethically, with your practices and your authority, where you've got clarity around what your church is so you can move forward on mission?
Yeah. So how do we move So I'm assuming that folks watching this have some sort of interest, right? This is probably a selective bias, that people watching this event, they either are already convinced or they're maybe hungry and, I don't want to use the word desperate, but they're like, I need something fresh, I need something new. And so how do we kind of clarify, cast, and stimulate vision that just is so that so you stay really hot on this topic, so you don't lose this among all the other. There are so many great opportunities often. How do we not let this fall to the wayside?
I think something that Efrain said around the I see in you conversation is crucial, because great churches are always built on great leaders. During the pandemic, we went through 3 merger conversations. Actually, we went through more than 3 merger conversations. We went through and completed 3 mergers as part of our church journey in the last 7 years. There were, I think at this point, 19 church merger conversations that we did not complete. 19 other churches that reached out to merge with us in the last 7 years. And some of those were one conversation, some of those were a months-long journey. But one of the things that we recognized through that journey is that there are great opportunities, there are great facilities, there are great communities, but we need more leaders. And so I think every church, whether you're in an associate role, a small group leader role, a lead pastor role, every church has to have 2 strategies when it comes to next generation. You have to have a succession plan, a succession strategy, and that succession plan has to start from moment 1 that you walk in the room. Not 5 years in, not 10 years in, but moment 1. Any book on succession, whether it be in the corporate world or in the church world, will tell you. You're going to have leaders that are going to look at you and go, are you trying to plan your exit? You're going to go, no, I'm trying to be a good steward with the leadership position I've been given. So you've got to have a succession plan. Every church has to have a succession plan. Every small group has to have a succession plan. And then secondly, you've got to have a strategy for sending. Because not everything is about succession. Not everything is about the growth of your personal organization. But you also have to have a sending plan. And it's so funny, my church has been on this journey of trying to figure out the scorecard when we know we're successful. How do we know when we're doing it right? And so as in my journey, I've done what a lot of us do, which is ask other pastors, what are you doing? And what I found is that a lot of our churches have a great strategy around the bringing plan, the front door of the church. And we have a great plan for leadership development, but we don't have a great sending strategy. Instead, what happens a lot of times, not every time, but a lot of times, is we by default look over the last 10 years when we're feeling a little down and go, look at all the people we sent. It happened by default instead of by design. And so I'd love for every church, every leader, every small group leader, anybody who is a disciple maker, making disciples who make disciples, as Efrain so eloquently put it, I'd love everybody to walk away going, I know my succession plan, and I know my sending plan. And it's an intentional plan, not by default, but by design, which means it's going to take thought, prayer, dialogue, discussion. And then that may even be the discussion that people step into. But it is absolutely crucial to the multiplication conversation because great churches are built on great leaders.
So I think there's a way that sending plans can be linked to this idea of models, right? Because sending plans aren't just church planting. So what are some examples of sending plans that have worked? So you clearly have a sending plan.
We've had a couple, yes. But I don't want to dominate either.
Just give one example and let's see some examples.
You know, like you even have some churches, like for instance, when we planted, we had about 4 or 5 different partnering churches that came alongside us. And they committed for 6 weeks that they were going to open up their congregation to see who would be interested in being a part of the first 6 weeks at our church. We call them like rocket boosters, right? So we'll send leaders, volunteers, we'll send also, greeters at the door. And what it did is for that congregation that is sending these rocket boosters, they began to take part in multiplication because they're saying, hey, we have partnered with this church, and for the next 6 weeks, we are sending missionaries, right? That's another kind of concept that we probably should begin thinking of church planting as we're sending missionaries to start a new church, but they're going to be there for a time period, right? And then the senior pastor, the lead pastor, can have a conversation with those leaders and saying, okay, you saw 6 weeks. Do you feel called to stay there? Or do you feel called to come back? So there's a lot of different ways, but that was one concept where you had people that said, hey, I feel God leading me here. And praise God for those lead pastors that held things loosely, were kingdom-minded, and said, go, we're with you, right? We're blessing this work. And because there are others that go, oh no, we're not even sending rocket boosters because these are all my people, right? And now that's not kingdom-minded. That's being all inward-minded, right? In your own kingdom. So I think that's just one, I don't want to take the whole time talking, but that's just one little area that came up.
Keep going. That was good.
What's your version of rocket boosters?
Rocket boosters, yes. So for one example that we have in the Wesleyan Church is Celebrate Church, which was a mega church and felt the call to really step into being a level 4, level 5 exponential multiplying movement. And they have now changed their model and completely shifted to now a network of 30 churches connected together. And they were all planted by people internally raised up who were already there. So the I see in you, open your eyes, be creative. A part of my story is I was a nurse for 12 years, in the medical field for 20 years before called into, if I didn't have that person who said, I see in you, right? And not just the nurse and, oh, she's already got a career, she's already busy, she's, blah, 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 versus like, hi, I think you might be called a church planting. This is important for us to make the invite and not say no for someone, and then see what God wants to do and say to them in that. But being willing to sit down and open up to what God may want to do, even if it looks different, even if we have to let go of something. This is who we are. Is it who God's calling you to be? And then following Him in that journey.
I think sending plan, when you go back to that conversation, these guys did such a good job in talking about that through the lens of church planting and church multiplication. If I'm a pastor and I'm thinking about a sending plan, I recognize not everybody's going to be sent out as a pastor, but some will. And so do I have a plan to send people into their workspaces? What's that sending plan look like in my church? Do I have people that are going to be sent out to the foreign mission field? I don't know how many of our churches have sent foreign missionaries in the last 10 years, but that used to be a thing. We need to go back when it comes to pastoral ministry and say, when was the last time our youth ministry called out students into vocational ministry? I think we did a really good job in the last 30 years or so of leaning back into something that Luther spent so much time in his ministry talking about, the priesthood of all believers, and saying every form, every vocation is valid in the kingdom of God and is part of ministry. But I think maybe unintentionally, we moved a little bit too far away from calling people into vocational pastoral ministry and recognizing it's both and so I would challenge every church to go back to having a call to ministry Sunday morning. I'd challenge every youth ministry to go back to having a call to ministry night, where this is just a regular rhythm and routine to our sending strategy. So I looked at summer internships, gap year programs, undergraduate and graduate support, mentorship afterwards. This is all part of our sending strategy. And so I'd love for us to think broadly about the subject, because it is a broad topic. Just like there are 100 ways to reach people, there are 100 ways to send people.
Yes.
And if we get too locked into a model or a methodology and all of that, I think we don't create a wide enough gate for all the people who are called to a variety of different things to feel like there's a valid place for me to be sent in this church. We unintentionally start to pigeonhole people and say, if you are this, then you will be celebrated. And if you're not that, then we just don't have a plan for you. And so we want to celebrate all people and all their callings and make sure that our sending strategy is robust. And that's just going to take time for a lot of people who haven't thought about it for a while.
Yeah, when we have a pendulum swing, you kind of move away from some of this like real focus on, oh, yeah, God's calling these people too. I'm interested to hear ways that I just think in a lot of our churches right now, second career kind of calling out.
Yes.
I mean, you talk about some experience in finance, you talk about experience as a nurse. Like there are ways in which I see, at least at the seminary, a lot of our students are kind of in that realm, right?
The statistics are there, aren't
they? Yeah, they're there.
Yes.
And churches have people in the chairs, pews, whatever we're sitting in these days, that God is calling them to specific things. And sometimes it is just stepping one level up. So how can we kind of encourage I've heard you all talk over lunch about like a DNA of multiplication. You know, there are a lot of ways that we can kind of structure things, like dedicating certain portions of budgets to something, but also just establishing that culture where everyone's thinking about, is it me?
Yeah, and Nathan, the reality is all the statistics tell us that the vast majority of churches and church leaders that are tuning in today are not in congregations that are actively thinking about multiplication. You can look at Lifeway, you can look at Exponential, you can look at a lot of denominational work. Depending on the study you look at, it's something between 5 and 10% of churches that are actively involved in multiplication. And so that means over 90%, over 9 in 10, are not involved in active multiplication. And I'm not talking church planting the traditional way. I'm talking about mergers, turnarounds, the sending out of, it can look like a lot of different things. And a lot of the way in which we're going to find these leaders is not through the traditional method of 18, 19, 20-year-olds being called on college campuses and then going and doing 4 years of an MDiv on a campus away from everything else. That still will happen. But it is a lot of the second career folks that are out there who sense that call. And we have a responsibility, I think, not just to widen our perspective on what someone can be called into, but also when they can be called into that. In their 40s, their 50s, their 60s, and to help them transition into that.
Well, I have a story that goes along with that. So whenever I graduated, I started working at a higher education institution, academic institution in central Pennsylvania. And I was in the evening with my wife, leading a college ministry. But during a good amount, I would say about 8 years, I was in higher ed administration during the day, working in admissions and registrar, and in the evening just making disciples. And there was one Sunday where my pastor at the time looked me in the eye and he tapped me on the shoulder and he says, "Brother," I remember this clear as day, "Brother, you have leadership in you. And I see in you I see in you leadership in the kingdom." And it was that moment that God catapulted me into ministry. Mm-hmm. If it wasn't for my pastor in the local church in central Pennsylvania, in the middle of amazing, beautiful Pennsylvania. I love Pennsylvania, beautiful, in the middle of just God's country. I call it God's country. We're right there. And one Sunday, I'm there with my wife, not thinking anything, just worshiping God. But he took a moment out of his time and pulled me aside, and he says, "I see in you." And he took me under his wing, discipled me, and we began to go on a journey together. And it was through that God really opened up the doors for continued ministry. Now, maybe you're a pastor right now and you're thinking, "Man, what are some practical things that I can do currently right now?" And we talk about some of this DNA. We have a DNA at our church, I'm sorry. But we talk about some of this multiplication DNA. Like, it can start simple, pray. It starts with prayer. If you don't have a multiplication plan or a sending plan, "God, would you break my heart for the things that break your heart?" Because the number one way to reach people who are far from God is through planting churches. So what are we doing on our end? Simple questions. Are we discipling people in our churches? I'm talking about one-on-one. Maybe it's 3 people that you'll get and you'll meet for coffee and go through the book, some sort of, the book of the Bible. Maybe it's training your small groups and you're looking at your leaders and you're saying, "Hey, there's leaders in your group right now. I need you to actively be asking God the question, who do we have in our group that can be that next leader that we could invest in and equip so that we could send them to start another group?" Maybe it's having commissioning Sundays. Whenever you launch a new small group ministry or a new small group, then you bring them all up front and you pray a prayer of dedication and commissioning and saying, "We are launching these small groups into these communities to reach the kingdom," and getting our churches to begin thinking about the Great Commission, but also practically. Those are just a few things that we could, begin to just pray and ask God, what are some things? And so I know this is not a how-to time, but these are just some little things that we can do to begin to just start moving the needle, because you're not hopeless. There is hope. Mm-hmm. God has placed you where you're at for such a time as this, at this moment, to make a difference, to move the needle, because the kingdom of God is at hand, and we must be intentional. What doesn't come naturally, we must be intentional in.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Encouraged with that.
So good. I want to challenge, in line with both of these things, challenge our leaders and challenge the leaders of the pastors, so your state, our district superintendents, those types of things, to look at co-vocational as plan A, not plan B. Yes. Because especially in the multiplication world, it will set you up for a freedom and empowerment, not only for what the church is able to do, but the overlay of relationships where evangelism and disciple making take place live time with people before they cross the line of faith, because of that presence in the workplace, in the marketplace. Another thing, Jake, that you brought up was multi-generational. So when we're opening our eyes, it comes naturally for us to identify and raise up people who look like us, sound like us, and are in the same season of life as us. We have to force ourselves to get outside that box and look and find and see, even if it requires us bringing a team together to say, "Hey, who are we missing here? Right. Who are we praying in?" So that we can be asking people to, "Hey, come follow me," who look different from us. Santis Beatty is the director of our Next Gen for the Wesleyan Church. We had our International Youth Conference, Follow the Call. 4,500 leaders and students, middle school, high school, and young adult, attended this conference. 500 students committed to either vocational ministry or co-vocational marketplace ministry, which is huge to cast that vision and then see that response. But it didn't stop there. Now there's calling labs. They're pairing every one of these students with a mentor that's going to help them walk the journey and identify the call and live that out and get connected, so that it just doesn't drop off as a really great mountaintop high at this conference in December. But what does it look like to empower and commission our students in 5th grade and begin equipping them then instead of 35? Now the 35's bad. We have an 80-year-old planting a church for the Wesleyan Church right now. I'm just like, great day for a church plant. Keep on going, right? Like, but what if we really shifted our paradigm to even an event like this? Okay, what middle school, high school are you bringing along with you? Yeah. The next church planting conference you go to, what young adults are you bringing with you? You know, and so yes, we have to broaden if we want to see a movement.
What are some more examples of like the best work across the movement, across Church of God, across the Wesleyan Church, outside the Church of God, outside the Wesleyan Church, where you've seen, look, that group of people is doing it, that woman is doing it, that woman is calling people out, that guy is calling people out, and that place is spinning out pods of kingdom activity.
I think there's a lot of great examples out there, and I just think to piggyback off of what Katie was saying, what I'm hoping people catch through this conversation is that maybe the lens to look at is a little broader than they once thought.
Yeah.
Because there are a number of pastors I've talked to that have just said, you know, Jake, multiplication it's not for us. I'm in a context where I feel like I have a lot of people in the third of life, and I don't see it possible in our church budget, and I don't see it possible in a lot of different ways. I see others who go, we've tried this church planting thing, and it hasn't worked, almost as though they forgot every one of our current churches was at one point planted, and that's just, every church has a life cycle. And so I would hope that we would remember the parable of Matthew 13 applies to the planting of the gospel. And while we are required to sow the seeds, the results are going to vary. And sometimes it lands on a path, but this is not something to try. This is a mandate to follow. And so our responsibility isn't to try and dictate. It has to look like this, it has to look like that, but rather to move us onto mission. And if multiplication is a bad word because of how you've been negatively impacted in the past, use the term sending, or use the term Great Commission, or use the term apostolic, or whatever resonates. That's the heart of what we're going after. And so when you talk about it through that lens, then I go, oh man, there are great examples of that. There are a lot of great church planting networks that are out there. I think Stadia was mentioned and Exponential was mentioned. There are great denominational church planting networks out there. We've got the Wesleyans are doing great things with Dr. Ed and with Katie and their whole team. The Nazarenes have that. The Assemblies of God has something called CMN, which is really successful. The Reformed Church has Acts 29, and they've had ups and downs, but they've planted a number of churches. ARC is another great example of that. They're all different theological persuasions. You've got smaller groups like Orchard Group that are out there that tend to focus on certain regions of the U.S. as well. And then beyond the denominational, beyond the multi-denominational, you have other groups like the Tampa Underground and the Casey Underground that are doing micro-church movements. You have ways in which people are getting into communities. You have things happening in Europe and with HTB and Revitalize Trust that are doing great things across Western Europe. You've got things going on in Africa and different seminaries that are sending and different agencies that have gone out. And so I don't think, and this is the whole point, I don't think getting locked in is the issue. I think the issue is, why aren't we all involved?
Sure.
We all have a part to play within this. It's everybody's participating, and finding a meaningful way for you and celebrating with a group, I think is easily done for all of us when we take some of the limitations off.
But how do you do storytelling strategy? Like in your spaces, like as regional pastors, you all kind of have some denominational or movement of responsibilities. What's your storytelling strategy to get more people buying in, to get more people thinking outside of their narrow lens, right? Like, I don't want church planting, but I like revitalization. Okay, let's talk about, like I think storytelling strategies are important. What can we do?
Yeah, so right now there's a restart going on right now in Richmond, Texas. And so for us, we're behind them 100%. So we're telling the story. We're inviting the pastor to, it's a co-pastor situation, but they're coming out and to our regional gatherings, and they're setting up a booth. We're giving them an opportunity to share their story. And then also we tell them about like the need for this, and just share the history of the church, where it's been, what it's going through now, and what it's going to be doing. And then showing the big why, and then give people an opportunity of partnership. Hey, this is an opportunity for your church to be a part of this. So that kind of, so that's just an example of storytelling. And then, we continue to share those who are being raised up and coached up to plant as well. So sharing the story is very important. You have to develop language too that goes along with it. Yes. Language that it's not dividing, but adding to the multiplication piece, because right away, probably some of the negativity that comes with multiplication is immediately people think you're taking something away, or there's division. Yes. They use those kind of terms instead of, hey, no, we're kingdom minded. We're sending for the kingdom to see God do an amazing work. So it's just developing language that goes along with the storytelling is key, because words are important.
Yes.
I mean, I think about the word sending. Probably lands better in older churches that can remember how many people they've sent. I mean, when I pastor this church, we celebrated 100 years. That was many years ago. But they would talk about the people that they had sent. Yeah. They probably were more comfortable talking about sending. And so I think that's what I'm talking about, this storytelling, right? Well, there are ways for us to talk about things that are growing. Talk about the kingdom growing, and helping people understand by me emphasizing revitalization or multiplication, planting, sending. I'm not saying what you're doing doesn't matter, but that you have a role to play in this broader thing. Yes. So let's talk about some of the kingdom collaborations that are out there. What are ways to collaborate across various lines? You seem to be collaborating in ways, and apparently also turning down some people. But how does collaboration work? Because I'm assuming, honestly, you see there's a barrier to collaboration in those cases. Absolutely. And so there's like discernment in what can collaborate, what can't collaborate. What are the options out there?
There are a lot of options, but I think the question around barriers is so situational, and that I think we may need 3 days of playing all that out. And so it would be almost unhelpful to start going down the line and then stopping. But I will say that when it comes to this conversation around how to storytell, most of the best storytelling moments are in the one-on-one, not off the stage. And it's because it is situational. And because if I get on stage and I share about a method or a system, everybody unintentionally believes that's what I need to do in order to be successful. And that's just not true. I've been in too many different contexts, both as a pastor, as a board member, as a coach, as a prayer supporter, all those different things, to know that what may work in one season may not work in the other. As my wife was has her master's in counseling. She said, I was sitting in a class one time listening to my professor, and She said, I just want to remind you that the one thing that'll keep you alive in one season is the very thing that'll kill you in the next. So if you wear a winter coat in July, you might die. But if you don't wear a winter coat in December, you may die. And so that situational piece is so crucial. And I think being able to tell the story of the church that you're sitting down and having the sending conversation or succession conversation with allows you to help contextualize and try and help them move just one more step down the road of where God may already be taking them. And so that's what we're trying to do with the storytelling. As far as the collaboration, I think it starts there in the one-on-one over coffee. I don't think we can move to denominations or to networks or to anything else before we're engaging on a local level. And I know that our region offers that where I am. I know Efrain's region offers that. I know the Wesleyans offer that as well. And so I would reach out, if you're already part of the Church of God or the Wesleyan, to your region. If there's no regional pastor, reach out to an adjacent region. I'm pretty sure you'll get connected pretty fast.
Indiana had a meetup yesterday, and they're having one tomorrow.
Absolutely, which is phenomenal.
Church at the Crossing. Yeah.
And so there are those systems within the networks and the places where we're ordained that we're already able to find some support. But then beyond that, there are a variety of different options. We talked about a few of those networks that are out there, the Stadias, the ARCs, the Acts 29s, the denominational ones that are out there where you can go for assessment, or you can sit down and kind of walk out. Am I called to plant a church, or am I called to revitalize a church? Dying to Restart is a great thing with Dan Turner that we've used in Kansas and are currently using with multiple churches right now. And so it really does depend. It really is situational. The resources are out there, and I think you're probably one phone call away from being connected to your upstream of people that you're already in relationship with.
Yeah. What networks did you work with? Or?
Yes, so I completely agree. It always is more powerful to have someone who's in the trench with you to say, hey, I did it, or this was the first step we took. That's the most powerful. And so storytelling, though, is to multiply that to a greater level is also very important. So within the Wesleyan Church, we have webinars on these exact topics and bring on local church pastors, emerging leaders that have that testimony, that have that story. Some are all of the stages of development or searching and being able to guide the viewer, the pastors and leaders who are viewing in, to say, hey, you're not alone. This is scary. Let's do it together. We, as the Wesleyan Church, have committed to have no lone rangers, that we always have a fresh expression or a church plant who has a mother or sending church or some type of network around it, so that, because we are not designed to do this alone, right? This life as individuals, as families, as married couples, or as churches and leaders. And so Greenhouse Network, Ransom Church Network, Celebrate Church Network, Dirt Roads is a rural church planting network. Nitrogen is an urban church planting network. Some of the experiences that we have, language leads and helps us learn at Stetzer, right? Yep. And so we in the Wesleyan Church speak heavily about the Acts 1:8 movement. So yes, the Great Commission, yes, the Great Commandment, but Acts 1:8, go here, near, far, and hard, right? And empowered by the Holy Spirit. And some of the expressions that we've seen as examples are house church or micro church networks. Ryan Delamater in Ocean Water Network in California has over 30 micro churches around the globe now. Natasha Dongle, the same with Follow Church. We have pioneering expressions, fresh expressions. John West is doing a pioneering training center in an effort to train up leaders, and I was blessed to be able to be one of the coaches in this training. And what we'd see was we're helping people say their next yes, and then we took next steps. And just like the network with, we need to have assessment centers, training, coaching, funding, residencies, availability for that. But we have two main trainings and assessments for them. We have the conventional congregational style assessment, church planning assessment. And then for the fresh expressions or the alternative assessment approaches, we have a wiring assessment that really looks at how are you wired? What are your strengths? What are your challenges? Who are you called to, and how can we come around you and empower you to do that well? So dinner church models, the Big Table in Kansas City has 6 dinner churches networked together. Marketplace multipliers, we have chapters all over the nation in the Wesleyan Church that are empowering local churches and the people in the community to be the feet and hands of Jesus and the gospel movement and Acts 1:8 vision in their workplaces.
That's great. I actually had an experience in my church planting experience where 2 networks collaborated, which was great. Stadia Church Planting Network and Houston Church Planting Network. And so Houston Church Planting Network has a residency where it's a year-long residency where you're going through, and that's where we're seeing a lot of success stories through residencies, right? And so when I moved to Houston, I needed to understand the context of planting in Houston. So as I partnered with Stadia and Texas Ministries, what Stadia did is they provided assessments, project management, also along the lines of fundraising, coaching, and all that. So I was getting the coaching and the day-to-day operations handled on that end during the pre-launch phase. But then I was able to get the cultural context, the ministry context in Houston through HCPN. So, we would meet with different practitioners across the city. We would meet other planters that have planted before in that area. And so there was just this amazing collaboration between 2 networks that produce fruit and are just, they work well together. And so I benefited from that. And so it was great. So there are networks out there that can help you and get on the right track. And just like Jake said, connect with your regions. They'll be able to provide you with more resources, and I'm sure there's some sort of multiplication cohorts and different things that they're offering to be able to help you move the needle in multiplication.
That's right.
And I think you're getting at this importance of coaching, right? This importance of, because coaches help you find the right timing, coaches help you find the pitfalls. And I even think there's this sense of, if we get some small steps, right? Coaches can help us take bigger steps, and then take bigger steps and take bigger steps. And understand that each of us has different giftings and callings and can also step into the wrong thing, right? But that because you don't have the calling to be a church planter doesn't mean you don't have a calling to help make disciples and be a sender and be someone who is nurturing up someone with those gifts to go do that. Not everyone's going to be awesome at fundraising, but they might be good at some other things. And so there are just so many different. I know as our steering committee was talking about what do we mean by varieties of multiplication? It really is this sense that our vision and imagination needs to be broadened, but that we're not doing all that God has called us to if we're just content with where we are. That there's always this sense that the gospel is supposed to be attractional. It's supposed to be, maybe it's an invasive weed, I don't know. That's what we talked about in panel 2. So I want to think about, we've got 20 more minutes before we go to some questions. Let's just get nuts and bolts. National, state opportunities that are around. Somebody wants to take a first step. What are you going to tell them is their first step?
Yeah, so in terms of, if somebody wants to take a first step, okay, well, I would encourage them to connect with their regions. Their regions, are prepared to help them take a next step towards multiplication. Different regions partner with different organizations and even networks as well. There's also the New Thing Network out in Chicago that Dave Ferguson and Exponential are I believe, heading up or they're a part of that. And so there's a lot of different ways of getting equipped, and being part of that process. So the first thing I would say, prayer. Begin to pray, Lord, what would you have me do here? Secondly, look within your own congregation to see where your leaders are. Thirdly, connect with your regions and see what kind of training programs they have to help begin the process of that. Now, if you don't have a region or anything like that, then you could look also into networks in your context. Kansas City might have some network. Connect with Jake if you're in Kansas, right? And so, but you just are proactive, looking for the right networks. But you definitely want to be, connected by your regional leader, so regional pastor.
I echo that very much. Yes, I think it's great. Even before then, if you feel this call and you feel what you're hearing urging, I'd encourage you to write it down, circle it and date it, and then call someone that very moment so that it doesn't fall off, because the devil's going to come at you 1,000 different ways of Wednesday and overwhelm you, dismiss the thought, 1,000 things, right? And so let's get it out of our mouth so we can have accountability in taking those next steps forward. I think that the connections in the Church of God that you have, you mentioned those as they spanned out. We have those the same as districts or regions, and then with headquarters with multiplication and discipleship formally abroad. But I think the point is getting into the networks and always asking the question, who else do I need to talk to about this? And then that will continue to get you to the people who are the right fit for your context in that season.
Absolutely.
I remember when I was, there are so many ways that you can feel overwhelmed as a church leader, right? You can be stuck. You can feel like you're stuck. You can feel like you're not preaching well enough to get the people to come back a second time. You're like, oh gosh, how many people came and visited once and they didn't come back? Was it my preaching? Was it we can kind of become overwhelmed. But I'm thinking of this kind of moment in the midst of just utter tragedy in the Middle East. But I knew that our church had a missionary in Turkey, and I knew that we were very tangibly participating and trying to do something. And so that was a moment of hope to share to the congregation. So I just think there's this aspect of a DNA of multiplication can start as simple as we're giving some money to this group because we know that there's more than just us. And that's, I think, one of the beauties of movements and denominations is there are things that we can do together that we can't do alone. There are ways that we can participate in larger energies and efforts. And so I just want to I think there's enough good questions here that are going to lead us down a few more paths. We're going to jump into some of these because they're going to get us at some of what folks are asking. And so keep pumping those questions in if you want. I've got at least 7. And there's like 20 we didn't answer from the earlier panels. I may make you answer those questions. But no, I think I want to hear and put this into questions. What's holding you back? What is your fear point? What is your risk aversion point? What is your skepticism about this? Where do you feel like this is off to have a chance to kind of talk to some of these things? So let's start with this. Someone from Ohio, Jake, wants to know, what are your talking points about mergers with your church and other churches that merge with you? We have a lot of dying churches around us. How do I talk to folks who might be interested in mergers?
Yeah, it's that's a great seminar that we could do. Yeah.
Well, you do that seminar and
if I'm not careful, we won't end up with any more questions. So I'll try and be really brief and just give you a couple of pointers. There's a book that was written by Warren Bird and Jim Tumberland called Better Together. Warren was the first reader on my dissertation, and so I'm partial to his thinking and his book as well, but I think it's very helpful. A lot of groups have used it. And what you want to do is you want to recognize that any conversation is going to be a process, and maybe the best way to think about that process is through a dating, a marriage, and then those first couple years of marriage that I'm sure went really well for you.
I love marriage.
Yeah. Most people have a difficult first or second year of marriage. That's just where it lands, because you're getting adjusted to sharing a culture, a DNA that you're going to create together. And so I would say that you want to start down the line of that dating process. What is the vision? What is the DNA? What are we looking at? Who's in charge? All of those logistics, just like you would in a dating relationship. And pretty quickly you can go, I don't know that this is going to work. I don't know that there's a compatibility. I don't know that there's a shared understanding of what this could look like. I'm glad we're having the merger conversation, to be honest, because we would go back and like Lyle Schaller, who was responsible for so many of the denominational mergers and earlier on, would say that his famous quote was, most mergers were built on two dying denominational churches. And so you'd have a failure and a failure coming together. And he goes, the famous quote is, in church mergers, often 1 + 1 = 1. And so what that did is leave a really bad taste in the mouth of people for generations. It wasn't until probably the 90s or the early 2000s that we started to have dying churches merge with life-giving churches or forward-thinking churches, that things began to shift in the minds of people around church mergers. And we began to see for the first time how a leading church's DNA could, when it's healthy, could be transmitted into a DNA that wasn't healthy. And you could create multiplication. And then we found that when you brought together a thriving church and another thriving church and put them together, then it multiplied tenfold. And so today, the best mergers are found when you have a church that's thriving with a church that's thriving that said, we can do mission better together. And so let's think about that then. You're talking about a number of dying churches in Ohio, it sounds like, churches that are struggling, trying to come alongside of them and breathe life. So what we've got to ask the question first is, in this dating process, is there a healthy DNA that we can connect ourselves to? If not, is there an outside leader that we can bring in with a healthy DNA? And are those ministries ready to change and move in a new direction? All those are the questions that have to be asked on the front end, probably on the first 2 or 3 dates before you get far enough into the dating process. And I'd also say that if that dating process typically lasts longer than 12 months, it pretty quickly becomes a distraction. And so go through the dating process. It'll probably take you 4 to 12 months. After 12 months, it better be a special situation, or you're probably like that couple that's been dating for 10 years that needed to get married a long time ago, or needed to break up because it was never going to happen. And so I just say maybe those are some of the starting points. I don't have time for all of it.
Any red flags?
Many red flags.
Many red flags?
Yes.
Any you want to say on camera?
Probably not. But I would say the red flags are around. Let's start with those 4 things. Let's start with shared theology, shared ethics, shared practices, and shared authority. Let's start with those 4 things. And if you find that there's a divergence in shared theology, I find this in the Church of God all the time. Oh man, we merged with a healthy church. Remember that when you diverge from your theology, ethics, practices, and authority, they have both benefits and consequences to the sort of merging of DNA that you're stepping into. And I just say those are maybe some of the places to start.
As a theologian, you may be tempted to merge over worship style first. That may be your earliest sticking point, but the long-lasting thing is we tell a different narrative about salvation. We tell a different narrative about the end of the time. We tell a different narrative about who is called. Yeah, all of those things.
Well, and to your point,
might get glossed over at first, but they will show up.
Because succession will happen and styles will change. So think about it as our core fundamental is our theology, and then it's our methodology, and then it's our practice. Practices change all the time. Bible studies can end overnight. I know in some churches, they're sacred cows. You kill a Bible study, you might as well kill the church. But practices have to be able to change all the time. Worship night used to be Thursday at 7, now it's Tuesday at 6. We used to do it this way, now we do it that way. Then methods change, but theology should rarely change. And so we want theology to stay as true as possible. Then our methods, Our practices are going to change all the time. So what I find is a lot of people love the practices, and so we merge to practices without ever thinking about theology.
Yeah. Yep.
And we've got to start theologically.
Yeah. All right, here's a question from our someone on our Spanish call. What do you do when a church is at the plateau stage? How do you recognize that? What are some first responses?
Looking at me.
Well, I think it's important to have a healthy assessment as to where you're at, and one of the key things is looking at the life cycle. Where are you at in this life cycle, right? And if you're seeing that you are plateaued, I think you need to ask some questions that provide some clear-cut assessments into your ministry, whether it's the team that you have around you, whether it's there's some circumstances in your community, or even your longevity there, as a lead pastor. I had a good friend once tell me, actually, a coach tell me, every pastor is an interim pastor, right? And we don't like that. I mean, right away we get tensed up. Because at the end of the day, that's God's church, and we're there for a season, right? And so that brings up the question of who am I investing in, and who is succeeding me, right? So I think those are questions that we always need to be looking at, and so. But if you are in that situation, one of the big things I would say is connect again, depending on where you're at, with your regions. They have some great, assessments for that, and also some training, and also resources to help you see where you're at in that. And then there's also opportunities for change and even revitalization, depending on what area you're in and what context you're in, and also what season of ministry you're in. That's a loaded question. There's a lot of variables that go into plateauing. So,
Sure.
I hope that helps, but it's just some things to help you think around that concept. So
It's situational, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, plateau.
But there are signs, right?
Well, there are, and it depends on how we're determining what plateauing means. Because if we're talking about my church hasn't numerically grown on Sunday mornings, I'm saying I don't know if it's plateaued or not. Right. I don't know if that alone is going to determine it.
Because you could have spun off a quarter of your church to do something else.
Yeah, the congregation. The congregation that I was originally pastoring, that would be maybe the mothering church in the situation with the mergers, has sent out 250 people in the last 3 years to other locations and to other places. So the congregation size is not significantly larger, but the church is not plateaued.
Right.
Is it plateaued because they feel plateaued? Is it plateaued because we're not seeing any change and we want to see change? So I do think it's situational. I think everything Efrain said is true, but I think it's a really difficult thing for us to be able to discern on this side.
I think I go back to honest assessment of what's really going on. Like, are we being honest with ourselves about why we are the way we are, who we are, what we're up to, what we really value, what we care about? And sometimes you can tell. It's almost like, to me, a trigger for some sort of action would be, if I'm honest, I sense complacency here. If I'm honest, I sense complacency. I don't sense joy, vibrancy, energy, passion. That's when it's like, I think you better start doing some things to wake up.
But is it possible that you're taking one step forward? I don't get to dictate the speed. Sometimes the speed is down to the congregation. Sometimes the Lord says, wait. Am I being obedient to the Spirit? Do I have a sending strategy? Do I have a succession strategy? Do I have a bringing strategy? Am I seeking biblical faithfulness? Am I being obedient to the works of the Spirit? For one person, that looks like plateauing, and for the other, that looks like biblical faithfulness. And that's what makes it so difficult. But it really does come down on the inside to, do I know that I'm being faithful in this moment? Do I have the strategy? Have I put all the systems in? And am I working it out in His timing and not in my own?
I think one of the things in self-assessment is our scorecard. obviously, and not only what is our region, our denominational scorecard, but what is Jesus asking us to have as our scorecard? And one of those questions that could be on there is, are we discipling? Like, are we actively seeing, I can name groups of people who are discipling and being discipled. Are people coming to salvation? Even that can take time, right? How long can it take? It can take years to walk with someone and disciple and evangelize until they cross the line of faith. But are people being sanctified? Are we seeing the transformation of hearts step by step by step? And a lot of that can be under the surface for a while. It can look like someone, we had a man who went from meth to weed. That's sanctification. That's his next yes to God.
Yeah.
And we're just watching people grow and take steps. And we had third generation disciples by 3 years old. But it took us 1.5 years more, 2 years more to get a fourth generation disciple. Did we grow? Did we have growth in there? Yeah, we did.
Right.
We had a lot, but it didn't look like maybe what a traditional scorecard may look like.
Yeah. All right, here's the next question. This is also from our Spanish Zoom call. Can you tell us about some reliable websites with accessible material and advice for discipleship and evangelism?
It feels really, you guys want to step in?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of material out there in terms of resources. But I think, I think you have to look back to, your theology and seeing scripturally if your people are growing, maturing, becoming more like Christ through the scriptures, right? For instance, like at our church, we do so we preach through books of the Bible. We have topical series, but we preach through books of the Bible. Are we intentionally taking people through a journey of Scripture and seeing Jesus? How do we become more like Jesus? How do we, just have Jesus, lead us and guide us? And so I think it's important to really, as you're presenting this information or you're looking at this information, that it's tied closely to Scripture. So that's where I'll start. But.
Yeah, I'm going to be really careful to recommend particular websites without the context.
Right.
I don't know the denomination or the movement that this person's a part of, and especially with it being a Spanish Zoom, and there could be better sites in Spanish. My recommendation is to reach out to, if there's a regional or a district coordinator or someone that they're in relationship with for that answer.
Yeah, if you're in the Concilio, I think talking to Marcos Garcia, Aristides Estrada, Ramon Rivera, they've all got some. I do think it's important, especially, I think it's important to know who's behind some of these resources, though. There are publishing houses that are more
Absolutely.
Wesleyan in nature.
Absolutely.
Like things from Abingdon, things from Beacon, things from the Wesleyan Publishing House, like Warner Press Materials, like those things. Aldersgate Press is working on some things, like things out of Asbury's. Seedbed. There are resources that are for, if you're from a Church of God Wesleyan background, those are going to have more of that embedded salvation language that is resonant with the Church of God tradition.
And read the index.
Yep.
Right? In many of our modern books, that's not the first time it's been written about or talked about. So go back through and find the original source and read the dead guys, as they say.
Yeah. All right. During a transition, this is for anyone. This is from Texas. During a transition, so they may or may not want to know what Efrain has to say. No, during a transition, when the lead or solo pastor departs, what do you believe is the main focus or mission of an interim pastor who steps into the congregational ministry?
Well, I'll start, and you guys can jump in. I think it's important that, the interim pastor understands where the people are at, right? And so there's got to be a level of care and love and healing that, depending on how the departure went, there might be a lot of wounds, a lot of hurts, and conflict. And so this person, when they come in, they have to be aware of that and come in with a compassionate heart, be able to listen to where people are at, but then also paint a picture of, of hope and working together, right, as in this short term until we identify another pastor to come in. So it's for a season, and it's a specific assignment that, I don't think anybody could just be an interim pastor. So this person has to have the right skill set, tools to be able to take that church through that transition.
And what kind of church DNA, to your point, what kind of church DNA are you inheriting?
Yeah.
Is it a healthy culture? Is it a culture of sadness? Maybe there was a moral failure. Mm-hmm. Is it a 40-year tenured pastor who's moving into retirement? Because as you step into that role, you're going, am I a caregiver in this moment for hurting people? Am I trying to help correct some dysfunction that's been in this church so that it can get back on mission, so the next leader can step into that healthy place? Am I looking at this as a 3-month or a 6-month or an 18-month transition period and laying out the timeline? And so I think that assessing the health, the vitality, and the length that you're going to be there is really going to set you up for success.
I think churches need to be clear with interim pastors what they expect, and those interim pastors need to be in some sense freed to push but honor what that church is saying, right? So like sometimes the church may go, this is what we want. You may be like,
That's not what you need.
Okay, have you considered maybe 2 months isn't enough time for what, or maybe 2 years is too long. I think some of those.
And living with the tension of how do I care for what the organization needs and how do I care for the needs of each individual? Yeah. Because sometimes they can be at odds. And the way in which you walk those things out can be both painful but also really joyful. I think it's a rewarding call that people can have.
Absolutely. All right. When referring to the, I'm trying to think what word this means. This is a Spanish translation that I don't think that word's right. When referring to the succession plan, could you talk a little bit further through some practical examples?
Me? Yeah.
I don't know. You've talked a lot about succession plans.
Of a resigning pastor?
Well, I do think it's actually interesting that you said you should start with a plan for succession right away.
Yes, absolutely.
And I mean, I was a 7-year interim once.
A 7-year interim.
Yeah.
Nice job. We're all interim pastors.
Yeah,
I was like,
man,
yes,
he was talking about me.
Yeah.
I was the interim pastor for 7 years. But I honestly, I kept that title. And in a sense, it was a succession planning because I knew of this sense of calling to higher education. But at the same time, I had this calling to pastor, and I loved it. But I never asked them to change they would have changed my title, but I was just like, you can just keep me interim. No one called me that. But it was like, in my mind, I was making decisions so that the church would be ready for the next season.
Yeah.
So I think that's some of that, right? Like that's an example of having a succession plan is knowing that you're probably not the last pastor of this church.
Yeah.
Like hopefully.
Yeah, I think a lot of reasons. I think a number one reason why people, not the only reason, right? And if you get letters over this, I'm really sorry, but
I get lots of emails.
Yeah. I think probably the number one reason why people don't have a succession plan is because they're insecure. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, we feel like we always, what will I do? What will happen to me? And I don't think that there's a room that I haven't walked in where I was given leadership in the last 25 years where I didn't think, who's my successor?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
whether it be in youth ministry, whether it be in small group ministry. At one point in my life, I ran the women's ministry. I was the janitor of the church. And it's always been, who's the successor? Who's next?
Yes.
And so when we talk about this idea of having a succession plan, we can think about it from a lead pastor position. But I think we have to start from day one thinking about that and refining that process over and over and over again. Not with a level of insecurity, but going, there is always room in the kingdom of God for what he's called you. Like, he will never not call you into something. He's not calling you into irrelevance. And so if you find somebody who does something better than you, that's actually a win. That's success. And your bills are going to get paid, and the Lord will provide. And whatever the fear is, whatever the insecurity is, that we gotta be able to get over that. And so how do we start with, I'm going to assume that we're talking about taking over a church, right? That this is in a local church. How do we think about a succession plan? I think we start by looking within. We developed Trellis, which is one program of what is 800 programs out there for developing the next generation of pastors. And as I started traveling the country, coming to our universities here in the Church of God and having discussions, I found a lot of people going, oh, I am all in on being involved in the next generation of pastors. And I cannot wait for you to send me an intern or a resident that I can train.
Yeah.
And very few people, if any, looked at me and said, I have a strategy for doing that within my walls. Yeah. And I don't have the expectation you're going to teleport someone from some far off magical country to come be my intern or my resident. Yes. But I'm actually going to raise them up from within. And Intern Academy does a great job with that. There are a lot of great programs doing that in different ways. But I think we've got to get serious about developing from within as opposed to trying to import people from other places. The Lord, I do believe, will sovereignly call you to people who are in other ministries to walk alongside of them. And that may be where your successor comes from. But I think the majority of time, look from within, look from the business space, those in other industries that may have a second career calling to pastoral ministry. Look from the youth ministry, the children's ministry, the college ministry, if you have it. I know a lot of our smaller churches go, that sounds great, I don't have any of those things. That's fine. We start today realizing that may take months or years, and as we're faithful and steward our role well, which succession is part of that, I think the Lord is faithful on the other side.
So Dr. I'd love my boss is watching, and he'll laugh when I say this. But we were about 2 years old into the church plant, and I called him and said, hey, I'm ready for interns and residents. Who you got? And he just like, raise them up from within. I'm not sending you anybody. Because that's the identity of the community. That's where you are, especially in a rural community. I had so many leaders who I was coaching and raising up, translocally. And as soon as they, well, come join in Thrive, and we'll, do a residency for 2 years. We live in a rural community of 3,500 people. There's not many people who are going to move there, with their family. It's really a call. And so I laughed. It wasn't funny to me at the time when he said that. But then I saw it later. And one thing I could say about that is on our launch of Thrive Church, I said to the congregation, I will not be here forever. We are going to be a church who multiplies churches. We are going to be a leadership who raises up leaders. We are going to be disciples who make disciple makers. We're going to die on that hill. We're going to live on that hill. And I won't be here forever. We're going to be a send or be sent church. So we will be sending, and I eventually will be sent.
And you grew your successor, right?
And yes, who we handed off last year in June, I baptized. The Lord said, I see in you, but I couldn't tell him that. He needed to hear it from the Holy Spirit that he was going to be a pastor. I had no idea he was going to be the pastor that would succeed us. But so I decided, started discipling him every week. I said, hey, I'm going to walk with you, bringing him along, exposing him to pastoral events and other pastoral relationships, networks, Hey, I think I'm supposed to be a pastor. I'm like, wow, that's really great. Let's talk about that. And, just intentionally walking alongside internship, residency, licensing, hired as associate pastor. Still, even a year before, the Lord told me a year before, like, if you stay, you will be hindering the movement of this church. It's time for you to merging. And I still didn't know that it was him, but I said yes to the Lord to seeing what that looked like. And there was that tension of time of, like, I know it's time for me to go to whatever is next, but I don't have the bridge that's going to make that. And of course, in his perfect timing, he spoke to that couple as well. And we knew that either they would go to plant a church and we would stay, or that we would be sent and they would be raised up. And he ended up being that. But our church knew day one that this was our expectations. About a year into the church plant, we told our ministry advisory team, or as a developing church status, it's our board, local board. And I was so nervous to tell them that the Lord was saying it's time to plant a church out of our church in the neighboring community, and we're a year old. And I was so nervous. I'm like, oh, we could get some like really weird reactions, or what's going to be. They're all like, oh, okay. I'm like, wait a second. This is not what I was praying and concerned about. Well, you tell us we're going to be a church of multiple churches. It's not a surprise. You guys talk about this all the time. Didn't know it would be this soon, but okay. Yeah. It's like, so that's what it is, where you mean it, and you're saying it all the time in every ministry, in every way. And then it happens, and then God provides, and then you go do it.
Yeah, you can cultivate expectancy.
All I was going to say is on the pipeline piece, just so our viewers have some context of the time on this, I think you should expect, if you're in a church that doesn't have that culture of building a pipeline, I think you should expect it's going to take you 3 to 5 years to build the culture, and it's going to take you 10 years to experience the fruit of the culture. So just so we have clarity, when after year one you go, this is not working, it probably won't. Even from a trellis side, our first year, all of our students came from other states or from other contexts. In year 2, they all came from Kansas City. In year 3, they all came from our church. And not that that's how it'll always go, but the point being is it just takes time, and you got to start somewhere.
People often need to see it to imagine themselves in that. And so there is something that I want to add a piece to the succession. Part of it is setting up expectancy and knowing that you're not going to hold the future, but it has to be paired with clear sense to the congregation. Like when you're talking about succession, it's not because you want to move on.
Right.
It's that you care about them enough to have a plan in place, right? They have to feel so cared for. I think that's why
it's a multiplication tactic.
Yeah.
Because what you got to remember, is that we think about succession often as the 30-year pastor or the 40-year pastor. The majority of pastors will leave their ministry post not by their choosing. And so you have to remember there are people who will have health issues. They'll have people who will have family emergencies. There will be financial challenges that will come up. Succession is a multiplication strategy. It's not you're out. And it's not through the lens of the 40-year pastor. Remembering the majority of pastors who are watching today will probably leave not by their choosing, making it to retirement. That may or may not happen. We celebrate pastors who have been in their roles 30, 40, 50 years for a reason, because it doesn't always happen. We want it to. Sometimes that's not even what should happen. Longevity is not always the goal, but I do think that's important to remember as a strategy.
But when people feel loved and they know that you're committed, they can think about the future without you better, right? Because then they're not afraid. All right. You were sharing, this is from the studio audience. You were sharing the importance of beginning with the end in mind, and I say yes, indeed. Would you say there's a definite cutoff age of the lead pastor and or years in the location? Kind of along these lines. No definites. Are there signs?
Oh, there's always signs. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, remember they would say the Levites retired in their 50s. So, I mean, we could look at whatever biblical model. I think we have to remember some basic parameters, right? That the pastor at their age tends to reach best 10 up and 10 down from their age. So if you have a 70-year-old pastor, there is a rule of thumb that says 50, or what would we say, 70-year-old pastor, 60 to 80, is going to be where their sweet spot is, because we all have our limitations. That isn't to say that can't happen in other ways, and so I'd be really careful to set ages.
Not that there's cutoffs or term limits, but there's ways to think about
Health and call.
health and call. Say more.
So, like you said, flags. There's flags. It's not an age.
Rules
like,
of thumb.
Hey, you passed 60.
Yeah.
Sorry. But really, like health, different seasons.
Absolutely.
And ministry and family are compatible. Just want to say that. Ministry and family are compatible. Parenting and marriage aren't exclusions to lead ministry in church planting. But we looking at the seasons of the heart, where you're at. Are you staying too long? Are you leaving too early? And that will not come from legalism. That will come from keeping in step with the Spirit, which yesterday we talked a lot about abiding in the vine and being able to listen so you can obey God's agenda, not yours, and then the accountability that you're walking with coaches, mentors, to be able to help you discern those things. And maybe even when you're known, they can call it blind spots, and I think we need to talk about attention or an ill health or some red flags that we're seeing, and then have that relationship to trust and be able to be humble and safe in enough to walk through that. Yeah.
All right. If you don't know this, I'm a basketball fan. I have a particular shade of blue. This isn't exactly the right one that I like when it comes to college basketball. Coach K seemed to manage to retool himself in different seasons of coaching. And he sustained this thing for a long time, and he learned how to coach in the one and done era. He just figured all these things out. So we got a question here that said, how can we retread, retool pastors who might feel dry, or there's an age here, like say they're 50 and they feel like, I got to retread, I got to retool, I need some new treads on these tires. What are some ways? Because I remember, like probably my 6th Easter in a row, I read this book called Undone by Easter. It's like, you've preached Easter how many times? How tomb's empty again, you know. But this sense that, like, what more do I have to say? But that there are pastors who have figured out how to grow and change, and there are times when you're like, you feel like I got to move because I'm dying, but I'm not done. God's not done with me. So, what are some ideas about retreading, retooling, while you're in ministry or as you're transitioning? What are some ideas?
Yeah, I think first of all, depending on the context and the situation, I think one of the key things is just checking on your relationship with the Father. I think it's important for us to really look at that and saying, all right, how is my relationship with God? Have I gotten into a place of complacency, or am I just going through the motions, right? But then also, in terms of soul care, I would ask, when was the last time you took some rest?
Yes.
Because sometimes we could be, every year, every Sunday, preaching and not taking a break, thinking that the world, the church will rise and fall based on you and your leadership, right? And which it does in terms of leadership as a whole, but sometimes we put the weight of the church on our backs and we continue to run and we don't take a break. And so I would, if this person has not taken a sabbatical or a moment of rest where they can really just say, hey, Lord, what do you have for me? Is this another season here? Is there something different? Is it maybe a different area, right? So I think it's important to have those two components there. So.
Sometimes you just need a nap and a snack.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I think is a huge factor in that is not the lead pastor or the visionary pastor recasting themselves, but if you are truly having a kingdom force, a team who is the voice of your leadership and collectively, you're having men, women, multi-generational. So you're not having to change who you are or how, what outfit, wardrobe you have based to reach the younger community. You have the younger community reaching the younger community, right? And they're at the core voice of who you are that creates a culture of your church movement. And so when we have a board or a church leadership that all look and sound the same, it's a very dangerous place to be because we are displaying as the church one uniform vision of God. We are seeing a limited imago Dei. And so it's something that I believe literally is one of the most important things that we figure out as leaders is, and even to not begin something until you have that diversity and unity on your team, in your ministry, whatever it is that you're launching, because what you have will propagate to what you will receive and what you will grow. And so when we already are those different things, we don't have to create ourselves into something new. We just give voice to the piece of that is already there.
I even heard from somebody today, like coming here, somebody said, this has really been life-giving. I think we can get in ruts in our professional development. Like I may have my tendencies that are super academic-y, and I need to get out of my academic space and go to something that, in my mind, feels more churchy, less academic. But sometimes a pastor needs to get stretched somewhere. Like nothing against Exponential, but like you've gone to Exponential for 12 years in a row, and like maybe try something different. Go to a sociology of religion conference that is going to show you all the different ways that church groups are like fundraising. I will say, I went to that one time. It was wildly fascinating. I'm not a sociologist of religion, but I was like, oh, this is all very interesting. Yeah. Like all the religious research that's out there. I think finding new ways to stimulate skills and tools, because we will. Like we have to change. The people in the pews change. The calling is constant of being faithful to Christ, being faithful to the church, being faithful to that purpose and mission of leading and of shepherding, of preaching and teaching and guiding and counseling. But you might need some different things to stoke that fire. It might be time for, throw a different kind of log on that fire so that it keeps burning. I really do think we can fall into ruts so easily. So that's my plea. Any other tips?
You took my thing.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
it was you got to get out. You got to get out and see some stuff, gain new perspective, see things from a different perspective, and keep it different. Yeah. Create the variety, as you say.
Yeah, there are so many different things. I know a place that'll. You can take some classes.
Yeah. Salsa dancing lessons. I'm starting next week. I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
I heard a stat, 60, so I can't verify this too heavily, but 86% of stats are made up, so let's go with it. 60% of pastors don't know the names of their neighbors to the left and to the right.
60%?
Do you?
I definitely do.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I'm like... My neighbors think I'm strange how observant I am of my neighbors. So
you're that guy.
That. Yeah.
You may need to
my wife would be like,
that.
That's a stranger. I'm like, yeah, that's Troy and his dog Cooper. Like, I don't know.
And studies show that the longer you're Christian, the less unsaved friends, pre-Christian friends you have, right, in your social circles. So getting outside of the box is not only good for us, but it's going to only propagate what's good for the mission as well.
think micro-learning is another thing. Like, this is a growing area. I hope that we'll be in that space more in the future, but like little micro-learning things, that's definitely.
That's great.
So salsa class, I don't plan to sign up for that anytime soon.
I don't know, is the Church of God okay with dancing?
We have a wonderful dance major here at Anderson University.
Wonderful.
If you're interested in dance, you should come here. All right, here's another question. How can a church achieve significant and sustainable growth, both in terms of quantity and spiritual quality, without focusing solely on membership numbers and neglecting the development of deep, committed faith in its community?
Yes.
Send.
How do you thread the needle? How do you balance the scales?
Yeah, I think that's what we've been talking about this whole time. And I think that, I think in their situation, we could sit down and probably talk through, okay, well, what needs to be managed? Mm-hmm. But my guess is if we keep it simple, if we keep after the Great Commandment and our formation and becoming like Christ, and the Great Commission and being a mission-sending agency and having a reliance on the Spirit within that, keeping those voices from the outside present in our lives, listening and having genuine accountability without high control that's seeking to dictate around our own personal agendas, I think we begin to move the needle, recognizing that the results will vary from season to season, but we are about biblical faithfulness. Mm-hmm. and recognizing that there will be fruit, there will be signs, but it's going to look different from ministry to ministry.
Yeah, and making sure keeping what's priority, right? The gospel, is being proclaimed, the Great Commission is being lived out, but prayer is at the forefront of any great move of God. Absolutely. So, we could get caught up with metrics and numbers and finances, but prayer is the key. And so developing a good prayer team, if you don't have one, I highly encourage you to develop one. People that are just praying for your church, for a revival, for your community, for your region, and for those who are far from God. And so, and then just continuing to raise up leaders. That is, for the kingdom of God to continue to advance, we have to move the needle in building up leaders and making disciples of them. Yeah. So,
I was encouraged and challenged in church planting, and now I do the same with those I coach, to have a minimum of 100 people on your prayer team that are devoted to praying for you daily, and then up along the way with specifics and within the movement. We have to have those internal and external interceders for if we want to see God move in these places.
I always think it's helpful to remember that any kind of growth is to be celebrated. We can sometimes get bogged down because we're not meeting the expectations we have. But to be expectant that God will move and to celebrate any move, I think sustains that long term and prevents you from those kind of doldrums of losing hope. So, all right, any last words? I think we're going to break here pretty soon. So as we come to the close of this third panel, we are ready for you to really take seriously getting something into action. What are you going to do? I believe this has been great. We've had fun. We're glad you're watching. We've gotten to hear so many new stories. I've learned new words in panel 2. I forget it, but I wrote it down, so I'm going to look it up here in a second. We're going to take a break. And at the end of this break, it's a short break. So this panel 3 doesn't have the full hour of discussion. I did send out some discussion questions at the sites. It looks like you'll have about 12 minutes of discussion questions and about a 20-minute break, so 32-ish minutes before we come back with Reverend David Culp leading a session on SMART goals and action plans. Snack, body break, but join us back here at 3:20 Eastern, and we're going to close this out with some SMART goals and action plans. Thanks for watching.